Title: My mother-in-law stole my key. I changed the locks. Story: I thought the new locks on my house were there to keep my mother-in-law out, but when I watched her and a stranger dismantle my deadbolt with a magnetic pulse, I realized they weren't breaking in to steal my things. They were breaking in to harvest me. The spare key to my house was supposed to be a symbol of trust, a safety net for emergencies. It lived in a magnetic box hidden behind a loose brick near the back porch, a secret my husband, Mark, insisted was common knowledge among family. But as I stood in the doorway of my own living room, staring at the empty wine glass on the coffee table and the distinct scent of my mother-in-law's aggressive floral perfume lingering in the air, I realized that trust had been weaponized. Linda didn't just visit, she infiltrated. She rearranged my spice rack, color-coded my bookshelf into a system only she understood, and, most unforgivably, had been going through the locked drawer in my home office where I kept my grandfather's journals. I'd walked in on her twice before, caught in the act of tidying up, each time offering a brittle, practiced apology that never reached her eyes. She treated my house like a rental property she was prepping for a new tenant, and I was merely an inconvenience in her way. Today, however, was the breaking point. A framed photo of my mother, which I'd purposely placed on the mantel, was face down on the hearth, its glass spiderwebbed with cracks. My pulse hammered against my ribs as I looked at the security footage on my phone. The camera had been triggered at 2 p.m. I watched the grainy black and white feed as Linda approached the back porch. She didn't fumble for the hidden box. She reached directly into her handbag, pulled out the key she had clearly borrowed and duplicated, and unlocked my door with the casual confidence of an owner. She walked through my home like she was sweeping for bugs, her movements calculated and cold. She wasn't looking for dust bunnies. She was looking for leverage. And when she sat at my desk and pulled a stack of private adoption papers from the drawer, my blood went cold. I didn't wait for Mark to get home. I didn't wait for a confrontation. I called the locksmith immediately. The guy arrived within 20 minutes, a grizzled man who didn't ask questions when I told him to strip the house of every existing mechanism and install the most sophisticated deadbolts on the market. As he worked, I felt a strange, intoxicating sense of power. I was reclaiming the walls that sheltered my life. I watched him replace the hardware, the heavy thunk-thunk of the new bolts sounding like a gavel ending a trial. By the time the sun began to dip below the horizon, I was a fortress. I sat on my sofa, waiting. I knew she'd be back for dinner, expecting to waltz in as she always did, carrying a casserole she'd prepared in my kitchen earlier that afternoon. I heard the gravel crunch under her tires around 6:30 p.m. Her familiar, brisk footsteps crunched toward the back door, followed by the metallic jingle of her keys. She reached for the handle, her movements confident, her head turned to talk to someone. Wait, someone else was with her. I squinted through the curtains. It wasn't Mark. It was a man I'd never seen before, wearing a dark windbreaker and carrying a heavy black leather satchel. She tried the key once, then twice, her face shifting from annoyance to pure, concentrated rage as the lock refused to budge. The man next to her stepped forward, pulling a heavy-duty tool from his bag, and I realized with a jolt of pure terror that they weren't just here to let themselves in. They were here to break in, and they had no idea I was sitting just 3 feet away, watching them through the glass. The man placed a crowbar against the frame, the metal screeching as he applied pressure, and just as the wood began to splinter, my phone buzzed on the coffee table. It was a text from an unknown number. "Open the door, Sarah. We know you're in there, and we know exactly what you're hiding in that office." My breath hitched, the sound amplified by the sudden, deafening silence of the house as the intruder stopped his work, sensing my presence behind the door, and pressed his ear against the wood, listening for the sound of my heartbeat. The silence on the other side of the door was more terrifying than any shouting match. I held my breath until my lungs burned, my hand hovering over the panic button of my alarm system, but I didn't press it. If I triggered the siren, they would know I was home, and if they were brazen enough to bring a locksmith, or whatever this man was, they weren't planning on running away just because of a blaring horn. I moved silently toward the kitchen, my heels hovering inches above the hardwood to avoid a single creak. My heart was a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Through the sliver of the window, I watched as the man pulled away from the door, his silhouette framed by the porch light. He wasn't reaching for a crowbar anymore. He was pulling something else from his satchel, a small handheld device that emitted a rhythmic, high-pitched electronic hum. Linda stood behind him, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her face a mask of cold, calculated indifference. She looked at the door, not with the frustration of a woman locked out, but with the impatient gaze of a homeowner waiting for a repairman to finish a task. She leaned in, her lips moving as she spoke to him, though I couldn't hear the words. Then, she did something that made my skin crawl. She reached out and ran her manicured finger down the edge of the doorframe, right where the new, high-security lock had been installed. She was checking for the seam. She was looking for the weak point. And then, she looked directly into the camera lens I had mounted under the eaves, smiled, and waved. My phone buzzed again. Another message, this time from Mark. "Hey babe, Mom said she's dropping by with a surprise. I told her you were busy, but you know how she gets. I'm stuck at the office until late. Just let her in for a few minutes so she doesn't keep calling me, okay? Love you." The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. Mark knew. Or at least, he was so deep in her pocket that he was willing to sacrifice my peace of mind to keep his own life quiet. I didn't reply. I couldn't. I watched as the man with the device held it up to the keyhole. The blue light from the machine flickered, and suddenly, the internal mechanism of my deadbolt, the one I had paid a premium for just hours ago, gave a sickening mechanical click. The bolt didn't slide back manually. It was being forced by a magnetic pulse. My fortress had been compromised in seconds. The door didn't swing open immediately. They were waiting. They knew I was standing on the other side, waiting to see if I'd have the courage to confront them. I backed away, my eyes darting around the kitchen for a weapon, a knife, a heavy pan, anything. But my hand brushed against the kitchen counter, and my fingers landed on something that stopped my heart cold. My wedding ring. I had taken it off to wash dishes before the locksmith arrived, and now it was gone. In its place sat a small, velvet-lined box I had never seen before, its lid open, revealing a piece of jewelry that was definitely not mine. A heavy, antique signet ring with a crest I recognized from the journals Linda had been snooping through. The front door groaned as it began to slowly push inward. I didn't run. I didn't hide. I gripped the heavy cast-iron skillet, my knuckles white, watching the shadow of the man spill across my floor. But just as he stepped into the light, the house lights flickered and died, plunging us into total darkness. In the sudden pitch black, I heard Linda's voice, not from the door, but from the darkness of the hallway right behind me, whispering, "You shouldn't have locked us out, Sarah. Now you'll never see what's in the basement." I spun around, the skillet raised high, but the darkness was absolute. The scent of her perfume, that cloying, synthetic jasmine, was no longer drifting from the doorway. It was thick, suffocating, and right against my neck. I swung the iron blindly, the air whistling as the heavy pan cut through the space where she had been standing only a second before. I hit nothing but empty air. My own momentum sent me stumbling, my shoulder slamming into the wall. I scrambled for the light switch, my fingers dancing frantically against the plastic plate, but the power was dead. Not just the lights, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint glow of the digital clock on the oven. Everything was gone. "You think this is about a key?" Linda's voice drifted from the shadows, mocking and calm. "You think you're the first woman Mark has brought into this house? You think you're the first one to think she could change the locks on a family legacy? My breathing turned into ragged, desperate gasps. I backed away, my hands groping along the wall until I felt the cold metal of the pantry handle. I squeezed into the small, confined space, pulling the door shut just enough to create a sliver of visibility. Through that crack, I saw the silhouette of the man in the kitchen. He wasn't looking for me. He was standing by the cellar door, the door I had kept deadbolted since the day I moved in, the door Mark insisted contained nothing but old storage bins and forgotten holiday decorations. The man placed his hand on the handle, and instead of picking the lock, he simply walked through it as if it were a curtain. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped animal. The cellar wasn't supposed to be accessible from the inside, without a key that hung in Mark's private safe. I reached into my pocket, fingers trembling, and pulled out my phone. The screen was dead. It wasn't just a low battery. The device was warm to the touch, as if it had been fried from the inside out. I was cut off. A muffled thud echoed from beneath the floorboards, followed by the sound of heavy metal dragging against concrete. It wasn't the sound of storage bins. It sounded like machinery. I realized then that my house wasn't just a home. It was a front. I had spent months trying to figure out why Mark was always so exhausted, why he insisted on working late, and why he was so obsessed with the genealogy of his family. I pushed the pantry door open just enough to slip out into the hallway. The house felt colder, the temperature dropping as if a window had been thrown open to a winter gale. I moved toward the cellar door, my bare feet silent on the floorboards. I reached the landing and peered down into the darkness. There was a faint, pulsating red light coming from the depths of the basement, casting long, distorted shadows against the walls. Linda stood at the bottom of the stairs, her back to me, talking to the man in the windbreaker. "She's seen too much," Linda said, her voice devoid of its usual performative sweetness. "She's not like the others. She has a suspicious mind. We need to reset the parameters before Mark gets back." I leaned in, my eyes straining to see what was illuminated by that crimson glow. My breath hitched in my throat as I finally saw what was arranged on the table in the center of my basement. It wasn't storage bins. It was a line of wooden boxes, each one labeled with a name in elegant, flowing script. My own name was at the end of the line, the box sitting open and empty, lined with a velvet that looked suspiciously like the fabric of my own wedding dress. Just as I reached for my phone again, hoping for a miracle of a signal, a heavy hand clamped down on my shoulder from behind, and a voice I recognized all too well whispered in my ear, "I told you to be more welcoming to my mother, Sarah." The touch was heavy, possessive, and impossibly cold. I didn't need to turn around to know it was Mark. The scent of his cologne, usually comforting, earthy, and familiar, now felt like a shroud, suffocating and clinical. I spun, the skillet slipping from my numb fingers and clattering onto the hardwood floor, with a sound that seemed to echo like a gunshot through the silent house. Mark wasn't wearing his office suit. He was dressed in dark, tactical gear, his face obscured by the dim light, his eyes, usually warm and soft, now flat, shark-like, and devoid of any recognition. "Mark?" I breathed, my voice barely a tremor. He didn't answer. He simply reached out and caught my chin, tilting my head back with an ease that told me he'd done this many times before. It wasn't an act of affection. It was an inspection. He looked at my face the way a butcher looks at a cut of meat. Downstairs, the humming sound grew louder, a deep, rhythmic thrumming that vibrated through the floorboards and rattled my teeth. Linda turned at the sound of the skillet, her heels clicking rhythmically against the concrete basement stairs as she ascended. She looked up at us, her expression one of mild, maternal disappointment. "You really shouldn't have snooped, dear," she said, smoothing the front of her skirt. "Everything in this house is part of a lineage, a very specific, very demanding lineage. We had hoped you would be the one to finally be content with the role, but you've always been so stubborn. What is this? I hissed, backing away until my heels hit the edge of the basement stairs. What are those boxes? What did you do to the women who were here before me? Mark's grip on my chin tightened, his thumb pressing into my jawbone with enough force to bruise. They weren't women, Sarah. They were vessels. And you're the first one to realize the locks were never meant to keep people out. They were meant to keep you in. He pushed me. It wasn't a violent shove, but a firm, guided pressure that forced me to stumble down the first 3 steps. I grabbed the railing, my knuckles white, staring down at the crimson glow. The red light wasn't coming from a lamp. It was coming from a console built into the very foundation of the house, a series of glowing nodes that looked like a biological interface. The boxes on the table weren't just storage. As the light pulsed, I saw the name on the box next to mine. Elena, flicker, and a thin, ethereal wisp of something like smoke curled upward from the velvet lining, disappearing into the ventilation shaft. The house feeds on the transition, Linda explained, her voice echoing in the stairwell as she followed us down. It requires a reset every few years. Mark picks the candidates, I handle the conditioning, and the house, well, the house provides the legacy. My mind raced. I looked at the exit, the bulkhead doors at the base of the cellar that led out to the backyard. I could make a run for it. But as I glanced toward the threshold, I saw the man in the windbreaker standing there, holding a tablet that flickered with the same red code as the console. He wasn't guarding the door. He was guarding the containment field. A soft, shimmering ripple of energy pulsed across the doorway, and as a moth flew too close, it simply vanished in a spray of white ash. Mark stepped down beside me, placing a hand on my lower back. His touch was terrifyingly gentle, the touch of a man leading a guest to a dinner party. Don't fight it, Sarah. It's painless if you stop resisting. You're already part of the foundation now. The moment you changed those locks, you bonded your own signature to the house's security protocol. He gestured toward the empty box with my name on it. The velvet seemed to vibrate, inviting, hungry. I looked at the stairs, then at the pulsating console, and finally at the man in the windbreaker who was now typing a final command into his tablet. The cellar door behind me, the one I had just stepped through, suddenly slammed shut, and the sound of the heavy deadbolt sliding into place was the final, sickening note in the symphony of my trap. Then, the wall behind the console began to slide open, revealing not a crawl space, but a vast, darkened chamber filled with dozens of glass canisters, each one glowing with that same terrible, rhythmic light. And inside the closest one, I saw a face that looked exactly like mine. The face in the canister wasn't a corpse. It was a static, haunting imitation of my own features, frozen in a silent scream, eyes wide and filled with a digital, flickering gray. My hands flew to my mouth to stifle a sob, the realization shattering my sanity. I wasn't just a wife. I was a spare part in a multi-generational machine of identity theft. The lineage they spoke of wasn't bloodline. It was a harvest. Mark didn't marry women. He curated them, refined them, and when the vessel grew too old or too observant, he simply archived them, uploading their consciousness into the infrastructure of the house to fuel the next cycle. You look surprised, Linda said, stepping up behind me. She placed a cold, heavy hand on my shoulder, her grip locking me in place. You were always the most vibrant one, Sarah. That's why we kept you for the full 3 years. The others were duller. Mark moved toward the console, his fingers dancing across the glowing nodes. The rhythmic thrumming in the floor shifted, rising to a high-pitched, harmonic whine that made my ears bleed. The ritual requires a catalyst, he said, his voice devoid of any warmth, as if he were explaining a software update. By changing the locks, you unknowingly initialize the hard lock sequence. You've effectively paved the way for the migration. You're going to be the brain of this house, Sarah. You'll see everything, hear everything, and exist within these walls forever. You'll never be able to leave. He hit the final key. The air in the room grew heavy, charged with static electricity that stood the hair up on my arms. I felt a pulling sensation, not in my body, but deep in the marrow of my mind, as if a hook were snagging my thoughts and reeling them toward the blinking console. My vision began to blur, the edges of the room warping into lines of binary code. I stumbled, my strength failing, as the upload began to tear me apart. But then, I remembered the one thing they had overlooked: the security system I had installed earlier that afternoon. When the locksmith had arrived, I hadn't just asked for new deadbolts. I had insisted on the top-of-the-line Smart Integrity Suite, a system designed to be impenetrable by any outside signal. I had configured the central hub myself, and in a moment of pure, panicked intuition, I had set a self-destruct protocol for any unauthorized magnetic pulse. As the machine pulled at my mind, I grabbed the heavy, iron-bound ledger sitting on the table, the records of the previous vessels, and slammed it onto the console's interface. It wasn't just a book. It was a heavy, conductive block of lead and steel, designed to house sensitive archives. It collided with the glowing nodes with a sickening crunch. Sparks erupted, white-hot and blinding, showering the room in a cascade of electricity. The high-pitched whine curdled into a guttural, dying shriek as the house's foundation began to physically warp. The man in the windbreaker screamed as the tablet in his hand exploded into shards of glass. Mark lunged for the console, his face contorted in a mask of primal, panicked fury, but it was too late. The magnetic containment field that had been holding the canisters shattered. The floor buckled. I didn't wait for them to recover. I scrambled toward the bulkhead doors, which were no longer held shut by an electronic seal, but by good old-fashioned broken mechanics. I kicked, screamed, and shoved, the wood splintering under my boots until the door gave way, spilling me out into the cool, damp night air. I didn't stop running until I hit the main road. I didn't look back as the house began to groan, a sound like a massive ship breaking apart at sea. The lights in the windows flickered violently, strobing in patterns that defied physics, before the entire structure imploded inward, collapsing into a heap of burning timber and twisted wire. I sat on the asphalt, shivering, as the sirens of the approaching police department wailed in the distance. Mark and Linda were nowhere to be seen, likely buried beneath the wreckage of their own ambition. Or perhaps, like their previous victims, they had become part of the very walls they once owned. A patrol car skidded to a halt in front of me, the officer rushing out with a flashlight. As he hovered over me, asking if I was all right, I looked down at my hands. They were trembling, stained with the gray, viscous dust of the basement. I reached into my pocket and felt a hard, cold object. It was the antique signet ring that had replaced my wedding band. I pulled it out, staring at the crest, a serpent eating its own tail. "Ma'am?" the officer asked, his voice shaking. "What happened to the house?" I opened my hand, letting the ring fall into the dirt. "It was just a renovation," I whispered, closing my eyes as the last flickering light from the basement died out, plunging the world into a silence that felt, for the first time in 3 years, entirely my own. Image prompts. 1. Cinematic shot of a terrified woman hiding in a dark pantry, peering through a sliver of the door at a mysterious man in a windbreaker holding a glowing, high-tech magnetic pulse device aimed at a heavy steel door. Moody lighting, realistic horror atmosphere, high resolution. 2. First-person perspective from the dark basement looking up a staircase. A woman holding a heavy cast-iron skillet raised in defense as two shadowy figures stand at the top. One a man in tactical gear, and the other a cold-looking woman, deep crimson glow radiating from the floor, intense cinematic thriller style. 3. A creepy, realistic scene of a woman staring at a rows of glowing, eerie glass canisters in a dark, hidden basement. Inside one canister is a ghostly, static-filled digital recreation of her own face. Cinematic lighting, 8K resolution, unsettling horror atmosphere. 4. Dramatic close-up of a high-tech smart lock on a wooden door being cracked by a magnetic pulse tool, blue sparks flying, a woman's terrified eye reflected in the metal frame. High contrast, cinematic suspense aesthetic.